are still joining us. Hello, everybody. Looks like we're mostly here. Okay, so hi and welcome back to our Department of Art Visiting Speaker Series. It's Monday. As usual, please activate your cameras and turn off all your mics until we get to the conclusion of the talk. And then you'll have the opportunity to ask questions. So this evening, Catherine Dignazio visits us to share her work. Catherine is Director of Data and Feminism Lab and Professor of Urban Science and Planning at MIT. She will return to UB tomorrow, as I understand, to work with some of you in the Design and Entrepreneurship Studio. Design professor and chair of the UB Department of Art, Stephanie Rothenberg, is with us today as well. Together, we are pleased to welcome Catherine Dignazio to UB. Catherine and Stephanie, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for organizing everything, Max.
Of course.
Do you want me to just jump in or?
Give us a little direction, Max.
Oh yeah, Stephanie, I was hoping that you might help us welcome Catherine, and then we can just get started and in about 40 or so minutes after the talk, we will let you all activate your mics and jump into conversation.
Sure. Well, I'm thrilled to have you here, Catherine. As I said, I wish it could be in person. I have a little anecdote of when I first became aware of your work. It was many, many years ago, and you were doing a project under your artistic name that you use, Canarica. And it was with the artist collective called the Institute for Infinitely Small Things. And I love how you, the Institute humorously defines yourselves as this globally unknown spatial justice collective.
Yes.
And it was part of a festival. It was a psychogeography festival, which I won't take too much time getting into, but people do a lot of really interesting explorations outdoors. And it was in Providence, Rhode Island. And the collective was doing this performance out on the streets, a street intervention. And there was a troupe of people in lab coats, and you were acting out the corporate commands. And I'm going to quote just the way that you define it, right? A corporate command is an instruction to the viewer, but it's in a very imperative form. So it's instructing you, as you say, into these abstract modes of being. Live like you mean it, right? You know, we encounter these in media all the time. And so the Institute was interested to see what happens when you would actually take this language literally, like right where it occurs. So I remember a group of people in their lab coats start lying on the sidewalk under a cell phone company, and I don't remember which one it was, but it was still kind of newer in this whole idea of the rollover minutes. Mm-hmm. And everybody was lying on the sidewalk in these lab coats, and they just started rolling over and over, and people had to kind of navigate these bodies, and it was just a really pretty amazing intervention. And then I don't think I saw this one, but when I was looking at the website, I really liked this one too, under a giant sign that said, "Become a believer." Yes. The Institute, you tried to get just, passers-by believe in psychic phenomena, right? And you interviewed people in Central Square in Cambridge, and you asked them about their experiences with ghosts and ESP and voodoo. And then this was back in probably early 2000s, I think. I met you more recently through a mutual colleague in 2018 when you were giving a talk in Toronto at this very important exhibition on data visualization called the Diagrams of Power. And it showcased all this really important work about the politics of data visualization. And that's when I found out more of what you were doing, the work on data visualization and defining a more inclusive feminist approach to data visualization and talking about why it's so incredibly important, especially now. And I'll go more into your formal bio that, you know, your practice is at the intersection of technology, design, and social justice. So it's very important to us as we're going to be launching in the fall a new Masters of Arts program in socially engaged graphic design and emerging practices. And you speak all over the world about data feminism, the importance of data literacy, feminist technology, and participatory design for urban planning and civic engagement. You run numerous workshops on data storytelling and analysis, which I'm sure you'll be talking more about, and even setting up some scenarios. And I also like this other quote that you organize hackathons for overthrowing the patriarchy.
Yes.
Yes.
It's
And
working. It's really working.
It's working. Great. That's so good to hear. We need to hear that. And you've published in numerous journals, and your art and design projects have won many awards, turbulence.org and the Knight Foundation, and you've exhibited at the Venice Biennale and the ICA Boston. And you're currently in this really incredible position as assistant professor of urban science and planning in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT, and you're the director of the Data and Feminism Lab. And we're very excited to hear you also talk about your new book that came out this year called Data Feminism. That really is looking at these ethics around data science practices and how we can all collectively build empowering new models, which is so important. So without further ado, I welcome you, and I'm so excited for your talk.
Thank you. Wow. Thanks so much.
That we have class.
Thank you. Wow, Tiffany, thanks. That was such a generous and nice and personal introduction, which is lovely because then it's always terrible when people just like read your really long bio. Oh, this is so boring. So yeah, I really appreciate that. So hello everyone. A huge pleasure to be here. I do wish it could be in person, but we'll work with what we've got at this point. So it's so great that you bring up the Institute's work. I'm not going to talk about that work, but I'd be happy to field any questions, about the intersection of art and design with research and scholarship, because it's sort of this like boundary zone that I'm continually navigating. I'm happy to talk about other projects, although mainly the talk tonight is going to focus on our recent book called Data Feminism. And I just want to acknowledge that the book is co-authored. So like all of my art projects are collaborative. I also wrote a book that is collaborative, and I will note that it's the book that was against the advice of my academic folks, said not to do that, and I did it anyway, and I'm glad. So our book is called Data Feminism. It's co-written with Lauren Klein. She's a professor. She's really coming out of like the digital humanities. So she's really trained as a historian, and she's based down at Emory University in Atlanta. So mainly going to talk about this, and you might be thinking like, well, I don't know how much you all do with data, but I actually think that data science and sort of technology development are a huge area of sort of design and huge place for designers in these worlds. And I'm also going to be talking a lot about communicating data and data visualization. So I think there's a lot of relevant things here. And so before I dive into the book itself, I just want to ground a little bit what the what are the motivations for writing Data Feminism. So we really see data feminism as part of a growing body of work that's holding corporate and government actors accountable for making essentially racist, sexist, and classist data products. And so at this point, this has been in the popular press a lot. Folks have probably heard about these things. So these are technologies like face detection systems that can't see women of color, hiring algorithms that demote applicants that went to all women's schools, search algorithms that circulate negative stereotypes about Black girls, child abuse detection algorithms that punish poor parents, data visualizations that reinforce the gender binary, and so many more things. So headlines like the ones you see here, these are just kind of like past couple of weeks kind of things. These are coming out every single day. So for example, here on the left, there was this remote exam proctoring system because people can't take exams in person, so people are doing it remotely. And the system identified a woman with dark skin as cheating on the exam because it couldn't detect her face. And so she was required to shine a very bright light on her face for almost 2 days that she was sitting for this very long exam. So things like this are coming out all the time. And we see a lot of these headlines that are like, oh my God, the algorithm is biased. And so I started very like shocked. How could an algorithm or how could a data set be racist or be sexist in some way? And in fact, like it's sort of like the fact that these examples do just keep coming out right now is one of the things that motivated us to write the book. And so here on the top of this slide, I have what I would essentially call a meme. And it's a meme that was made now kind of a while ago, like I think 8 or 9 years ago, by The Economist magazine, in which The Economist said in one of its issues, data is the new oil. And it's something that they meant in a good way. Like they meant oil like money, like as in there's lots of money to be made from oil. And yet there's also these other metaphors that are sort of apt for this particular moment. So like there's this metaphor of oil as a natural resource and data as a quote unquote natural resource that we can mine, that we can extract, that we can process, that we can clean, and ultimately that we can turn into profit. And the question with all of these things, right, is profit for whom? Like who benefited from oil? That's very uneven. And who's benefiting from data? We see this literally in like the corporations that are the big 5, top tech corporations. But we mainly see this benefiting folks at the sort of the top of the social hierarchy, let's say. And so this is where, we kind of situate our book as part of a growing body of work that doesn't only include us, it includes many more folks that have come before us, which are essentially pushing back on this narrative of like, data's the new oil, it's something we should exploit and like turn into profit and money. To in fact explain that data is the same old oppression. And we list out some of the inspirations and the books that we draw on kind of heavily for our work. And mainly this work is coming from women of color, from white women, from indigenous people, from immigrant communities, LGBTQ folks, and more. And they're all basically saying the same things. Like actually data is the same old oppression, meaning like it's just sort of accelerating and exacerbating an existing and very unequal status quo. And so what we explain in the book and sort of our contribution to this conversation that is ongoing is around feminism in particular. So thinking about how do we add and draw on intersectional feminism in order to inform some of this pushback and in order to inform how we might use data to actually challenge some of this inequality. But first, we like to do a little bit of level setting around the word feminism, because everybody brings their own kind of histories and genealogies of the words. There are multiple feminisms. Some of them are not compatible with each other. And so we like to kind of be very explicit about which feminism we are drawing on in the book. So in 2017, in the wake of the Women's March on Washington, the Me Too movement, Merriam-Webster, the dictionary, actually made feminism their word of the year. And so our first definition of feminism comes from Beyonce, but by way of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, by way of actually Merriam-Webster again. And so Beyonce, this is the definition Beyonce actually samples in her song Flawless. And so one definition is feminism or feminist is somebody who believes in equal rights for men and women and non-binary people. And so this is a feminism, here is a belief. But yet at the same time, if you have that belief that all genders should have equal rights, then all you have to do is kind of look around and see that that is not true. Like that is not realized, that belief is not realized in the world. And thus feminism implies a kind of commitment to action. So it's also organized activity on behalf of women's, trans, and non-binary people's rights and interests. And so feminism is belief, it's action, and then it's also a set of theories and ideas. And so it's like an intellectual heritage. It's something that we can draw from. People that came before us kind of created these incredible ideas, and we can draw from those to understand and basically transform our present moment. And so feminism as a kind of intellectual heritage begins by thinking about issues of inequality in relation to sex and gender. But in the past 40 years of scholarship around feminism, this has brought many more dimensions of inequality into the conversation. And so this includes race, class, ability, sexuality, and many more things. So that leads to the most important part of this like short takeaway or short intro, which is that feminism in the year 2020 must be understood as being intersectional. So this is probably a term that a lot of you are familiar with. This is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a legal scholar. She's here on the bottom right. And she uses this term to explain how social inequality can't be explained by only one dimension of difference. We can't only talk about gender when we talk about inequality, or even when we talk about sexism. We have to talk about the intersection of forces and factors that produce it. So how does sexism intersect with racism or with classism and so on? And the key thing to understand about intersectionality, and is sometimes overlooked, is that it doesn't just describe markers of individual identity, like what kind of like personal identities do I have, but it actually describes the structural forces of power and their intersection that create those effects. And then here we just wanted to call out to the Combahee River Collective, just as a way of seeing that intersectionality as an idea has actually a quite long history that stretches back into the 1800s. Crenshaw definitely coined the term, but there's a kind of really rich heritage of, in particular, Black feminist thinking that has always theorized about intersectionality, like has always considered gender and race and class as being like not separable dimensions of inequality, and argued that we always need to be talking about all of those things at the same time. And so intersectional feminism, like the important takeaway here is that it's not only about gender, it's not only about women, and it's not only about gender, and what it is about is power, who has power and who doesn't. And in today's world, data is power. Like you can see that through that data is the new oil meme. You can see that in terms of who's on top, which companies have the most money right now. You can see that in so many ways. But you also see that in this idea of data as the same old oppression. And so our basic idea here is that intersectional feminism, if we can take that and apply it to data science, we can help that power be challenged and changed. So in fact, like data science needs feminism, and it needs intersectional feminism in particular, if we ever hope to change, overturn these power imbalances. So what I would like to do now is a super short breakout group room with a very small number of people. So we're just going to we'll go to breakout groups for 3 minutes. And we'd just like people to discuss with their group, do you identify as a feminist? Why or why not? Because I think it's just interesting to think about like what gets stirred up for us with this word feminism. What do we bring to that word? How do we see ourselves in relationship to that word? So Max will make that happen.
Everybody should be in their room. Oh, hey Max, maybe you can close the rooms. I can't chat you for some reason. But Oh, okay. Yeah, because it seemed to it looks that way. I'm sorry because I
oh,
haven't.
they're all in 3 rooms.
It looks like 3 rooms now. I'm just realizing that now.
Oh, no worries.
Should
Well,
I bring them back?
let's bring them back. Maybe they
Okay.
said something interesting. Oh, those
Yeah,
were probably large.
it might have been a noisy but useful 3 rooms, or we can try
Yeah.
that again. All right.
No, it's fine. I don't want to take up too much time on it. If anyone wants to report back in chat, it's welcome. It turns out we put you in 3 total rooms, so they were very large rooms. So if anyone wants to, yeah.
I see
That's
that,
right.
yeah.
Jessica, I'm wondering, did anyone in the room talk? Because it was such a big room.
Jessica, do you have your mic on?
Okay,
Oh, yeah.
that's great. Okay, so you did talk. That's good. Fabulous. Okay, I think we're all back. All right, apologies for the groups being a little bit large. I think we had 3 groups instead of groups of 3, but hopefully some productive conversation happened. And if anyone wants to report back in the chat, that would be lovely, but not required. So, all right. So, but one of the reasons for just sort of thinking about this is for thinking about the ways in which the word feminist or feminism has been co-opted, challenged, backlashed, and used in a lot of different ways, but also how feminism itself carries its own set of exclusions. And so in any case, I think it's a useful conversation. Oops. Maybe you can mute. I think we're hearing some background noise. But anyways, it's a useful conversation and a useful reflection for yourselves to think about, like, this idea of whether you identify, and if so, how, and which feminism. Okay, moving on. So in writing the book, Lauren and I sat down and we asked ourselves, what have we learned from our own both academic and activist practices in feminist circles? What kind of literature can we read to draw out how feminism may be useful for thinking about data science and data visualization? And we came up with these 7 principles that, for us at least, were the most important things to be thinking about in terms of trying to relate intersectional feminism and data science. And this is the way that the book is organized. So each of these principles is a chapter in the book. And in each chapter, we try to discuss examples, both of the feminist thinking that inform that concept, and also the people who are actually doing this. So like people who are actually examining power, or people who are already challenging power with data, and so on. And so our goal was to operationalize feminism for data science. So to think about how we could provide a model for people who are working with data, who want to work with data in the future, or people who want to refuse to work with data. And so these principles, there's 7 of them. I don't have time to go through all of them tonight. But the one thing I do want to draw your attention to is that there are 2 principles that relate to power. And they're the first 2 chapters of the book. And those are examine power and challenge power. And this is because this, and that's kind of also what I led with here, this analysis of power is so central to the feminist project. Okay. And so what I'm going to do is show a couple of the stories and examples from the book and talk a little bit about the principle that they illustrate. And so we'll start there with power. So in the book, we tell the story of the artist Mimi Onuoha's efforts to collect what she calls missing data sets. So she has this project called the Library of Missing Data Sets. And so these are data sets that a reasonable person might expect to exist because they address issues of really pressing social need. But for various reasons, they don't actually exist in real life. So these are things like trans people killed or injured in instances of hate crime, or people excluded from public housing because of criminal records, and so on. So one version of the project is a GitHub repository where she keeps this list. But then another is this physical artwork, which you can see here on the left. So it's very simple. It's a filing cabinet with folders. Each one of the folders has a label with the data set. And the idea is that you tab through the folders physically, and you look at the labels, you take out the folder and you open it up. But of course, they're all empty because there are no records. The data are missing. And so why are the data missing? It's because of a lack of personal or social or political or government will or some combination of those things. And so it's this idea of the forces of power at work, and that this principle of examining power points us towards. So the first step involved in data feminism is thinking about how do we examine the forces of power that determine which data are collected. There's been a lot of talk recently about bias in algorithms or bias in data sets, but there's also bias in what we even choose to collect data about in the first place, because that choice is about an allocation of resources to say this thing is important enough in the world to measure, thus we are going to collect information about it and know about it in some way. So like, which data do we collect, which research do we undertake, and which do we not undertake? And so the next example comes out of the chapter about challenging power. So feminicide in Mexico, and also in pretty much every other country in the world, because the phenomenon of feminicide exists everywhere. This is another case of a missing data set. In the book, we tell the story of Maria Salguero, who she resolved to head straight towards the problem and collect the missing data herself. So just to back up a little bit, feminicides are gender-related killings of women and girls. They include cis and trans women. They're legally defined as hate crimes in a number of Latin American countries, and thanks to the feminist movement, actually. However, even though there are laws criminalizing feminicide, the state does not systematically collect data on the phenomenon, like where is it happening, when, and classifying murders as either feminicide or not feminicide. So feminicide is the subject of emerging public anger in Latin America. And so I encourage you to check out the hashtag Ni Una Menos. And folks are angry about this because of the way in which the state neglects to fully implement its own laws and provisions. So frustrated by this lack of action, Maria Salguero basically one day in 2015 said, I am going to collect this data that nobody else is collecting. And for the past 5 years has now ended up compiling the largest archive of feminicides in Mexico, the largest public archive, I should say. She spends 2 to 4 hours a day, and this is not her job, but she spends 2 to 4 hours a day logging feminicides on a Google map that she reads, that she learns about from media reports. She's helped families locate loved ones. She's provided data to journalists and NGOs. And she's actually gone in front of Mexico's Congress several times to testify about her database. And so in the book, we talk about this as one form of feminist counter data. So a type of activist counter data collection that steps in when the state or other counting institutions have really systematically failed to ensure the basic safety of their population. And so it represents, like, this idea of counter data collection represents one way to use data to challenge power. It's not the only way, because there are situations in which more data is not better, right? But collecting counter data can be a powerful strategy. And just to make this like a little bit kind of even more related to our current context, this has happened in terms of COVID-19 and the US scenario, where our counting institutions such as the CDC and HHS are systematically failing to count in a way that is transparent. And so what we've seen is the upspring of these basically external to the state counter data collection efforts. So things like the New York Times case tracker and the COVID tracking project, and then bolstered by groups like Data for Black Lives, who are leading a campaign to really press states and counties to release data by race and ethnicity, so that that's not systematically being counted, even though we know there's all these disproportionate racial impacts. And then same with actually sex and gender data as well. That's another thing that we are not systematically counting and releasing in terms of COVID-19 data. But challenging power doesn't only have to be about collecting counter data. So it can also be visual, and it also can be really quite simple, as this visualization by Andy Kirk shows. So this is a circle. So it's a data visualization, but it's sort of meaningless, right? Because we're showing 100% male presidents. So imagine it's a pie chart, but like the pie is like in one category, right? But this is simple and it's funny. And so this idea of challenging power takes place anytime a decision is made to turn your lens, to turn your focus to unequal systems of power, and taking those as your main object of attention. So I want to talk a little bit about another principle, which is embrace pluralism, that comes out of the book. So this idea of embracing pluralism, it comes from Donna Haraway. And this is the idea that the best knowledge, or for you all, the best design or the best art, comes from bringing together multiple perspectives. And Donna Haraway actually calls this feminist objectivity, because she's like pushing back against the idea that there can be this one genius, objective, universal explanation for something that's going on in the world. And so in this idea of feminist objectivity, knowledge is not top down, but it's actually created through dialogue, through exchange, and through relationships. And by bringing together multiple sort of grounded perspectives, we get a more complete picture of the problem at hand. And so we see this work going on in the example of the anti-eviction mapping project. So this is the map that you see here on the left. They're also known as AEMP. So they're a self-described collective of housing justice activists, researchers, data nerds, artists, and oral historians. So since 2013, the AEMP has worked to quantify and to organize around the housing crisis in San Francisco. They make maps. They make a lot of maps. If you go to their website, they have like over 100 maps right there. But they do so in collaboration with tenants' rights organizations and community groups. And then they also create oral histories. And so that's what you see here in this map, which is called Narratives of Displacement and Resistance. So each of the red dots represents one eviction that has taken place in the San Francisco area. And then each blue dot leads to a video story about a single person or family who's facing displacement from their home. And that's sort of important to know just about their process, where like they actually started out literally just mapping evictions, like dots on maps and things like that. And then they quickly realized that it wasn't enough, right? Like the dots on the maps weren't enough to communicate what is lost when somebody is displaced from their home. And so that's where they started in with like this balance of both sort of more quantitative, you know, dots on maps, thematic maps, and things like that, but with oral history projects, with data murals, with community data literacy sessions. And so here they're kind of like balancing both of those things in the one map. But in the book, we contrast this approach with the eviction lab. And you can see their map on the right. Theirs is the 48 United States map. The eviction lab is based at Princeton, and their goal is to present a national picture of the eviction crisis. This is a really worthy goal. I just want to say, we're not trying to like take their project down or anything. But what's super different about AEMP versus the eviction lab is the process that they engage in. And in the book, we tell like a kind of longer and more detailed story, and also how the two groups kind of have butted heads at various points. But the long and short of it is that in the eviction lab, really, for them, the project is really about the production of this beautiful visualization that shows the national eviction crisis that they get credit for, basically. So that's like about their original research, their visualizations, and their data science. Whereas for the anti-eviction mapping process, it's highly relationship oriented, and it's also about building community solidarity and working in collaboration with the many different kind of actors and stakeholders on the ground, which also means collecting much higher quality data. So they have a much higher quality data set for their smaller area than the eviction lab has for the national scale. And that's one of the things that folks butted heads around. And so on the one hand, we have the eviction lab who's really prioritizing size and scale. And then we have the anti-eviction mapping project who's emphasizing data quality. And then of course, relationships and process. And we hold them up as an example of why in a kind of a feminist data practice, this idea that process matters, how you get to the beautiful product at the end matters. And in fact, maybe the beautiful product is not the point in the first place. But then it does raise this kind of thorny question for designers, especially, I guess I would say, because if we're like talking about having this very pluralistic design process where we invite many people into the equation and we do all this like deep listening and co-creation and so on, we can't bring literally everybody's voice to the table. So how do we prioritize and who do we prioritize in a design process? And so here, following the work of folks like Sandra Harding and Patricia Hill Collins and Xiaowen Barzel, a feminist design perspective takes power into account and centers the experiences of people at the edges and the margins first and foremost. So what does that mean? It means kind of like looking at what is the, what kind of thing are you designing? And that you can imagine in this like theoretical example, there's this like group of people in the middle, which represent the majority of people who might use said thing that you are making. And so, but instead of designing for that middle, you actually look to who's at the edges first. And we mean who's at the edges from a kind of power and positionality standpoint. So from a gender standpoint, from a race standpoint, from an ability standpoint, and so on. And the idea there is that actually by designing for those folks at the edges, we actually design to support everybody. I mean, very kind of similar to that idea of like universal design. And this is also really in line with the principles of the Design Justice Network, which actually folks here might be really interested in checking out and becoming members of. And so one of their principles is we center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the design process. So really thinking about like who has the potential to be most harmed by this thing that I'm making, and that's who I will seek out, and that's who will be part of my process, and that's who I will build relationships with. Okay, so if it's not already apparent, the principles of data feminism apply to every stage of a data science project. From inception and funding to production, circulation, and impact in the world. So it's not only about like the data set, it's not only about the visualization. So the previous examples have focused on the issue of power and people. And here we want to talk a little bit about the principles of rethink binaries and hierarchies and the principle elevate emotion and embodiment in one example. So feminism takes on, since an early kind of days of feminism has always taken on the binary. And so we can think about that as the gender binary. So typically a binary is defined by a hard distinction between two groups. And feminist theory really helps us think through that men and women binary. And as we say in the book, usually when we see a binary, it's usually hiding a hierarchy. And so the distinction between the idea of man and the idea of woman is an obvious reference point. There's more than two genders, as we know, and no one gender is any better. But one of the key moves of feminist theorists is to take that critique of the gender binary and use it to question other binaries and hierarchies that we encounter in the world. So things like the distinction between nature and culture, is that really a binary? Or the distinction between subject and object, is that really a binary? And this example takes one of these false binaries on. And this is this artificial distinction between reason on the one hand and emotion. So typically in this like sort of Anglo-Western context, we've been taught that reason is somehow better than emotion. And we see this play out a lot in data visualization. So best practices for data visualization often involve a kind of a clean design, a minimalist aesthetic, a kind of like just the facts, ma'am presentation. But why? And this is a question we ask in our chapter 3, which is a lot about visualization. Why do we value this kind of minimalism, especially when research has shown that we interpret these aesthetic choices really emotionally. So we actually start, when they're minimal like that, we actually start to see them as being more truthful than they actually are. So in the book, we contrast these two charts. You can see one chart is about US gun deaths, and the other chart is also about guns and shooting, and it's from the Washington Post. It's sort of like a more generic bar chart. In the periscopic gun deaths visualization, it's actually animated. You can go look at it. And each of the people killed by a gun is represented by one of these arcs that goes across the screen. They're traced one by one on the screen, and they start out slow, but then they get faster and faster. It's really overwhelming to watch it. It's almost unbearable. And that's sort of the point that the visualization makes. It's an epidemic. But then when this came out, folks in the visualization community were like suspicious of it. They regarded it as like an opinion piece. It wasn't seen as being as scientific or as real as, say, this sort of more anonymous bar chart down here on the bottom left. But a feminist approach would say that it's not a problem at all that something like this makes us feel things. And in fact, it's a more compelling visualization because it blends reason and emotion. And so rebalancing that, especially in data visualization, allows us to open up the data communication toolbox and to focus on what really matters in a design process, which is honoring context, listening to experience, and then using all of our tools and skills to challenge imbalances of power that we encounter in the world. And so I think I will, let me see for time. Yeah, maybe I'm just going to move here to the last point. So the very last point I want to make is something we say right at the beginning of the book, and we say it right at the end of the book, but then I actually feel like we didn't devote enough time to really making the point. We kind of say it in passing in both places. But we really think that data feminism requires an expanded definition of data science. And so thinking about like what counts as data science, we think it's not about the size of the data. It's not about the sophistication of your statistical techniques. It's not about the technical credentials of the people who are doing the work or what elite universities they're affiliated with. These kinds of dimensions are continually used to exclude women and people of color from the field, as well as to exclude work whose contribution is socio-technical or cultural rather than purely technical. And so if we have this like expanded definition of data science, to mean not just big data, not just PhDs, not just elite institutions, then we can see, and this is what we try to show in the book, that some of the most exciting work in data science today is being undertaken by artists, by journalists, by humanists, by community organizers, by activists. And so here we want to just give a shout out to folks like Margaret Mitchell, whose work is here on the left. She and her team do work on bias in natural language processing. That's work that looks a little bit more like traditional data science. But then in the middle here, we have artist Stephanie Dinkins, who's pushing the boundaries and the scale of data science with this sculpture that she has. So this is an interactive talking sculpture. And this was trained on an intergenerational dialogue between Black women. So you can walk up to it and talk to it. It's an AI, like a kind of a chat bot, but it's only been trained on dialogue between Stephanie and generations of Black women in her family. And so it gives you very specific answers that relate specifically to Stephanie and her family. And then the pudding on the right here, this is data journalism by the pudding. where they have a really nice data story exposing gender bias in Hollywood screenplays. And then finally at the bottom, there's an example of work by the duo Data Therapy, where they work with community-based organizations and they create data murals. So they actually move community-based organizations through a data literacy and learning process. And they have them work with their own data. And then the output of that sort of learning and literacy process is a mural. And this is an example of one of those murals that they did in Somerville with it's like a youth program that creates community gardens around the city of Somerville. So this was installed in a community garden. So just to wind up, here's some things that designers can do. So you can think about, how do we examine power? So how do we do work that interrogates and exposes racism, sexism, and other forces of oppression? How do those forces show up in data? How do they show up in culture? How do they show up in the world? Think about how to challenge power. So visualizing counter data, missing data, using design to hold powerful institutions to account, using visualization to advocate for equity, teaching people about data visualization, about design. These are powerful ways to bring other people in and challenge the status quo. Elevating emotion and embodiment. I feel like I don't really have to say that to artists because they already do that. But like, that's like one that's really for the data scientists. Embracing pluralism, including more people in the design process, especially people who are impacted, especially in a negative way, potentially by what you're working on. And then finally, making labor visible, which I didn't really talk about, but really thinking carefully about on whose shoulders are you standing, and making sure you credit everybody in the process, as well as reflect on your own identity. And so I think that's it. And I'd love to be in touch with you all, and I'll see some of you in the class tomorrow.
Thank you, Catherine, for this powerful presentation. If we have some time, for those of us that won't be there tomorrow, probably have some questions.
I had a question. So can we get your book online? Can we download it online, or do we have to get it in paper?
Yes, thanks. That's a great question. I didn't even plant you in the audience. Yes, if you just Google data feminism, and like the first or second result that comes up is probably our book. It's published in an open access way. It's on the MIT Press has this website called PubPub, and that's where it's published. If somebody has a second to go out and look for the link and paste it in the chat, that would be great. But yeah, it's open access, and you can just read it now.
Okay, thank you.
And there's the link that Dina just
posted. Thanks, Dina. That's great.
I have a question. I'm just curious, like the data that you guys are collecting, is it just United States or throughout the whole country?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The examples that we show, and we're pretty specific about this. At first, we had goals about trying to make them more international, and then we realized that it's sort of out of the scope of our ability. And so they're pretty US centric, although we do pull in examples from Latin America. And then I think we have a couple examples of this really creative work going on in Africa by this organization called Dignazio, where they do fashion shows with data, which are amazing. But yeah, but I would say like kind of coming from a more of a US based context.
I've kind of a very broad question, so I apologize for that in advance. But I was just wondering, when you're talking about the activism around counter data, with so many platforms for communicating information of competing data, that appeals to different data sets that appeal to very different communities. I'm just wondering if you kind of envision any kind of systems or methods for sorting or filtering, or actually more specifically directing that kind of counter data?
Yeah. You mean like, do you mean like sort of indexing the counter data themselves so that you can find better like data sets about different things that were collected by others?
Or
Is that
more
what you
that,
mean?
I guess I was just wondering about like how you direct like an opposing implication as a result of data that's collected, a kind of counter data that's collected. How do you feed it back so that it's not just kind of more and more information, but that it's directed in a way that might be useful?
Totally. Yeah. I think that's a great question. And I I think in different domains of counter data, like people are doing different things with it. So I can give you the example that I've started working with more now. When I was doing the research for the book, I was really just so impressed by the work of Maria Salguero in collecting that information on feminicide. And so I've now gone further and started collaborating with some activists on who collect that data. So Maria is not the only one who's doing that kind of work. There's folks actually all over the world at this point that we've learned about her doing these counter data collection efforts. And even just on that same topic, we've started interviewing those folks. And even on that same topic of feminicide, um, people do very different things with the data. So in some cases, like Maria, for her, it's about just really having it and putting it on that map. Like that's the point. And then anything that flows from that, like the media attention and stuff like that, is great, but it's not her goal necessarily. Whereas another group that collects that feminicide information in Spain, what they do with it is like every 5 years they publish this massive report, which then they take around to policymakers and try to use to lobby them for like changing laws, for allocated resources and things like that. And then in other cases, some of these feminicide collection efforts are related to social movements. And so it's really about like building solidarity with feminist social movements. And then it's about like turning people out into the street based on when a case would happen. And then they would like alert people and say, okay, it's time, we need to go out and protest. And so I think like, yeah, so I think it really varies. But in general, almost everybody does something with the data. Like it's usually not just like sitting there, even in like Maria's case where she's not publishing all these policy reports or anything. Her story has been picked up so much by the media. Like she's really become quite famous both in Mexico and internationally for doing this work. And so I would say like that in itself is its own kind of influence, or sort of like a place where the story of the database has like traveled, you know? And so like that's another way that I think it impacts. So yeah, and then I would say again, like there's these very human impacts. So a couple of the organizations that we interviewed, they use their data to then make connections to the families of the people who have been murdered, and then some of them run programs to support the families of survivors. And so like it translates into kind of very direct sort of like relational work with them. So yeah, so very varied. And so I would say there's no, like, because even on that one issue area, there's no uniformity to like, what is this for? And there's no one measure of like, what does success look like? Or what's the theory of change? I think they almost all have different theories of change or something. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. I'm just also scanning here I know there were a couple of other things that came up for you. I'm looking back through the scrolling chat here.
I have a question. Can I?
Oh, yes, please.
Okay. Has there been any like has this like data gone towards creating new legislature or laws? Like is there anything like that is now in place because of it?
A great question. Not that I myself could directly connect, no. But I would say like the feminist movement overall in Latin America, I think, is largely behind a lot of the legislation changes in Latin America around feminicide. But it's not only about these data collection efforts, like it's much more than just that. And I think that would be my yeah, like my caveat about like how much importance do we place on data itself versus like all the other work that goes into transforming the world, right? Like data are important and information is important to have, and it can be, unfortunately, particularly important for people who are marginalized or people who are minoritized in order to make a case that to people in power that things should change. But I think data on their own, data on their own don't do that work. Like it's like people mobilizing data do that work. So yeah. And then there are cases where, we've been collecting data forever and nobody changes anything. so I think that's also very true and unfortunate reality as well. So I think it's always good to keep in mind what are the kind of like limitation. Like I don't want us to give too much agency to data or information, because I think by itself it's in a vacuum.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I have a question.
Go for it.
Hello, Professor. So as you mentioned in the beginning of your presentation, you said that data science is a field full of oil, but it seems like data feminism is not, because like the example you gave, the women who works on feminicide in Mexico, like she spent hours every day just to work on it voluntarily. So how would you encourage and drive more people to dive into this field and to fill in all the blanks for data feminism?
Yeah.
If it's not profitable.
Yes. This is the question. This is a great question, because I think this points to some of the reasons that those gaps exist in the first place. And it relates to a point that we make in the book about data about women's bodies specifically. So like we talk about the case of Target, the company Target, they did this like predictive algorithm to say when they thought a customer was pregnant, and they were quite right about it. And it turns out they ended up sort of like inadvertently communicating that a teenage girl was pregnant to her family, because they sent her all these like pregnancy coupons or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so there's that case, which became very famous. And we contrast that with the case of maternal mortality data in the United States, which like we actually do not, this is a little bit changing now, but we have not had a comprehensive federal information about maternal mortality in the US, especially broken down by race. And so it's sort of like, on the one hand, it's like we find out we have data on things that are profitable. So we have data on when women are pregnant so that we can sell them crap, and then we don't have information on when women are dying, because like, who cares? Like they can't buy stuff. So, I mean, it's like super cynical about that, but I think it does point to this larger problem, which is like, why did those gaps exist in the first place? And I think fundamentally there is a question of money and resources at the bottom of this. And so like, not only do we have to work at filling those missing data gaps, let's say, but we also have to work to re-engineer the systems that produce that world, because that world is messed up, right? So that's not a world that I want to live in personally. And so I think we have to like take those larger structural transformations. But I do want to answer your like actual question, because like I think too, in a pragmatic way, there are, and this is why I'm excited about particular fields right now. Like I'm excited about the arts, about journalism, about library and information science. I feel like these are places where one can do justice-oriented data work, actually. And they're not going to make as much money as like being an executive at Target, but like, but they are legitimate occupations, you know? And so I like those kinds of pathways where, in a sense, like, you know, I was taught in a journalism school or journalism department for 5 years. And, you know, one of the key sort of norms of journalism is to use information and data to hold power to account. So in a way, like, your job is to question systems of power. So I think like there are occupations and spaces for that, beyond just like, yeah, volunteer labor, which is obviously challenging to have many jobs and some of them being volunteer jobs. So, yeah,
Thank you.
thanks.
Just want to make sure everybody's had a chance to speak up this evening. Catherine, again, thank you very much for making the time to be with us tonight to share this important project.
Thank you.
And I'm sure that, well, the conversation will be continuing tomorrow. If there's anything else to be said about that, or we'll just stay tuned.
Thanks.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for all your chats. Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you all for coming and taking your time on the Zoom. I know everyone's on Zoom all the time now. So I appreciate that you spend some of your Zoom life with me. So, no, thanks for having me. And yeah, I'll see some folks in the class tomorrow.
Okay, and everyone make sure to note the link to this book, and we'll see you the next time.
All right. Awesome.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Have a good one.
Good night. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.